Hello, can everyone hear us? I was just talking to someone morning all, and this is us trialing post-COVID technology and making the most out of it. So we are today joined by our colleagues and our customers in Melbourne, in Brisbane, and here in Sydney. So welcome everyone. So before we get started, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. The Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, Karingai people in Sydney, and Yagira people in Brisbane, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to extend that respect to Indigenous Australians among us today and across the country. My name is Biljana Nikolova. I've met quite a few of you, and for the ones that I haven't, I'm the Executive for Government, Education, Community and Indigenous Business here at NAB. And I'll probably take a couple of minutes just to tell you a little bit about NAB Education and what gives us the license to talk to you about the education sector today. We've been around and proudly servicing the education sector for more than 150 years. We currently have more than 25 specialized education bankers around the country. And whilst we're a national business, we also bank and again are privileged to help out 1 in every 3 Australian independent schools around the country, which means that we work very closely with our customers in education. We obviously take the time to listen, observe, and again, have the privilege of being able to synthesize that knowledge and share with our customers. Closer to what's happening in the education industry and the broader economy, the Australian economy is still performing quite strongly, right? We did a stellar job through COVID. Having said that, we are starting to see a little bit of a slowdown, and the expectation is that there may be some cash flow pressures going forward, given increasing interest rates and inflation. And as we will hear this morning, pressure stemming from the rising cost of living is one of the biggest stressors for Australians. And people are not only noticing price increases more, but they're changing their spending habits and also lifestyle habits. The good news for us, though, is that we know that pretty much everything else goes before parents decide to cut on their, obviously, school fees, tutor fees, and stop spending on children. So we're in a good spot. And despite the volatile conditions, the activity in the sector is very strong. Most of our customers are continuing to focus on master plan developments. We're seeing lots of activity in that space. So this is obviously open call to all of you if we can help in any way to assist with obviously master plan developments today or into the future. Please continue to talk to your bankers, and we would love to do that for you. So why we're here today? Well, we're launching part 1 of our latest NAB Education Insight series, focusing on the well-being of high school students across Australia. And this year, for the first time, we're doing that through the eyes of our students and through the eyes of our parents. And yes, we're joined, as I mentioned, by customers and colleagues, education colleagues here in this room in Sydney and across the country. So welcome to everyone one more time. And delighted to have Jack Stevens from EdStart and his team here today. They have helped us out and collaborated with us on this event. So warm welcome to you too and to the team. And thank you for supporting us. A little bit more around well-being and in the Education Insights report. The Australian Catholic University defines student well-being as a sustainable state of positive mood and attitude, resilience and satisfaction with self, relationships and experiences at school. When students feel well, when they're happy, secure and are thriving socially, they can fully participate in and learn from their daily routines, play, interactions and experiences at school. So what emerges from this inside report is a complex set of problems. And there is a bit of a clear divide in students' perceptions of their well-being and how parents perceive how their children feel about well-being. And interestingly enough, and we talked quite a lot about this internally in terms of obviously presenting the results, we find that quite a few of these findings won't be a surprise for schools. We believe that parents will be somewhat surprised by what actually comes through. And with these results, we're highlighting some significant challenges and opportunities for schools. So children's well-being is the shared responsibility of governments, students, wider communities, extended families, educators and parents, and it is not the sole responsibility of schools, which may not be the views of some parents. So at this point, I would like to invite Anna Ferris, our Education Plan Director in Melbourne, to introduce our first speaker, Dean Pearson, who will tell us a little bit more about the findings of the Education Insights Report. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Liliana. So Dean Pearson is our first keynote speaker. Dean leads a team of analysts responsible for providing unique insights into our customer and business behaviour by intersecting economics, psychology, and advanced data analytics. As a behavioural economist and commentator with almost 30 years' experience, he's worked to debunk the view that humans are rational, clear-thinking beings. Instead, we behave and make choices that are often illogical and based on emotion. And if we truly understand the economy, it is important that we know the underlying emotional state and motives of the people who work and live within it. And I present Dean Pearson, our keynote speaker for today.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. As Liliana mentioned, our economy here in Australia remains remarkably resilient. Our business conditions survey that went out only a few days ago shows that business conditions are well above average. We've got a labour market that is still very strong. But as she also mentioned, we see economic growth slowing pretty sharply going forward under the pressure from higher interest rates and inflation. So the key questions really that most economists and governments are grappling with at the moment is how households will respond going forward to higher interest rates, how quickly inflation will moderate, and most importantly, how that strength in that labour market will translate through to wages growth. So overall, as I say, Australia's weathered the pandemic remarkably well, but it is also, I think, transforming the way that we think about the economy and also the way we think about society, because now we're more than 3 years into the pandemic. What's become very clear is while human beings collectively do not enjoy radical departures from their daily routines, in fact, we spend an awful lot of effort trying to avoid any change whatsoever. What we've actually discovered is we're a lot more adaptable and a lot more resilient than many of us first believed. No event in our lifetime has changed so many behaviours as suddenly and as radically as COVID-19. Now, the pandemic actually made people feel time was distorted. If you were older, you felt time slowed down. If you were younger, you felt time passed much more quickly. The pandemic has particularly disrupted the normative tasks of younger adulthood, such as schools and the transition into the workforce, being sociable and, of course, developing relationships. Younger adults, especially teens, face greater restrictions on activities and experiences that are typical of youth, and that has resulted in high levels of social anxiety across many parts of the world. Now, for a long time, as Liliana mentioned, we've wanted to do some detailed research on high school children. It's difficult. It's difficult to get a sample of kids, and we've got a representative sample of Australian children, we think, here. And as Liliana also mentioned, the results pose a lot of challenges, but also significant opportunities, we think, for schools at a time when there is an increasing focus on mental health and well-being, and more importantly, growing parental expectations around a more comprehensive, more proactive, and a more tailored well-being solution for students. Educators understand, I think, this only too well, and importantly, what comes with that, which is more pressures on budgets, more pressures on teachers, and more pressures on support staff. First, as an economist, I couldn't resist giving you a quick update of the economy. So firstly, I'll just show you quickly how we see the global economy. Now, we actually think the global economic outlook is a little bit stronger than we anticipated, largely because of the recovery in China, and advanced economies appear to be a bit more resilient than we thought. Having said that, that improvement shouldn't really be overstated. We forecast the global economy to expand by 2.6% in 2023, down from 3.4% in 2022. To put that in context, outside of the global financial crisis and the pandemic, that would represent the weakest growth rate since 2001. Our outlook for 2024 is 2.8%. That's also below the long run average of the economy between 1980 and 2021. So the world grew by that on average by about 3.4%. So it's an economy globally, it's growing, but it is not growing particularly strongly. The positive side is China. China's rebound appears to be more rapid than most of us had expected. Following the abandonment of their zero COVID policy, we had anticipated a disruptive transitional period across most of the first quarter of this year. Instead, what it looks like is most of the impact happened between mid-December and mid-January. If you look at things like subway passenger movements, traffic congestion, it really all points to a significant pickup in economic activity post the Chinese New Year holidays. So our forecast for the Chinese economy is 5.4% in 2023. Now, much will depend on the confidence, not just collectively across the world, but definitely in China, of consumers. There is no guarantee that they will unleash the built-up savings that they have amassed. Now, global inflation data, more importantly, is showing a slowing trend in consumer prices that continued into December. While global inflation might be past its peak, you're still seeing stubbornly high inflation in places like the US, the UK, and France. Stable in January, but generally inflation remains well above the targets set by global central banks, which means there, of course, is scope for further policy interest rate hikes in the coming months. And of course, there remains a number of risk factors across the world at the moment for the global outlook. There is no resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We're now 12 months into that conflict, and that continues to disrupt supply chains in energy, grains, and fertilizer markets, for example. Inflation has persisted for considerably longer than most central banks anticipated, and as I mentioned, that really does increase the risk that central banks will raise interest rates further to curb inflation. You've also, of course, got the slight problem of balloons being shot down out of the sky and some tension between two big powers at the moment. Now, moving to the next slide, please. Where do we see the Australian economy? Well, as Billy said, remarkably resilient is probably the message for Q4. You've got retail sales only coming off slightly. You've got business conditions well above long-term averages and a strong labour market. But interest rates will work, and we'll show you some of the sentiment that is building. And looking forward, growth we expect will slow quite sharply. We still think house prices will fall collectively by about 11% over 2023, which will take a peak to trough decline of about 18%. That will flow through to consumer sentiment as well. Dwelling construction, business investment are also expected to fall a little bit this year. Labour demand should soften a little bit. We've got employment growth unlikely to keep up with the sort of population growth that we're anticipating coming back post-COVID. So we have unemployment rising to around 4% by the end of 2023, drifting higher to around 4.75% by late 2024-25. What the government and what particularly the Reserve Bank will not want to see is an unemployment rate with a 5 in front of it. That will have big implications for a number of sectors. So with that dynamic continuing, we've got wages growth about 4% later in the year. That would be the highest rate of hourly wage growth since the mining boom and the upper limit of what the Reserve Bank would be comfortable with. Having said that, unemployment rising over the next 2 years, that will take some of the heat out of the wages growth, and we think they'll be back in about a 3%, mid-3% range by the end of 2025. Now, there are encouraging signs here too that inflation is starting to moderate a little bit, but it's coming back, although it is still remaining quite stubbornly high. So we've got a cash rate that went up again in February by 25 basis points to 3.35%. The Reserve Bank wasn't very subtle in saying they think there are more rate rises coming. We anticipate a peak in the cash rate of 4.1% in May. That includes 25 basis point rises at each of the next 3 meetings. So a cash rate, when it gets above 4%, that will impact economic growth. Hence our expectation, as you can see, for GDP growth of below 1% in both 23 and 24. Enough of economics and other parts of economics, which is more important in my world at the moment. Now, by many measures, Australia is overwhelmingly a more prosperous and a better generation than previous generations have enjoyed. We've longer, we've got healthier lives, we've got bigger, better homes, we've got more education, we've got more comfort, we've got more convenience and more wealth. At the same time, almost half of Australians will face mental ill health during their lives. Suicide is the main cause of death amongst Australians aged 15 to 49 years. Now, GDP is closely tracked as the key benchmark for our prosperity, but it tells us very little about how people feel, their individual well-being or their happiness. And to be fair, it was never intended to do that. Now, for about a decade, we've been tracking wellbeing based on the methodology of a man called Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics in 2002, whereby wellbeing is measured across a number of domains: happiness, life satisfaction, life worth, and anxiety. Happiness, as Kahneman describes, is a momentary experience. Satisfaction is a long-term feeling. The somewhat depressive conclusion that Mr. Kahneman came to about 10 years ago is basically people don't want to be happy. What we actually care about is having a really good story about our lives. We care less about enjoying ourselves than presenting the appearance of an enviable existence. Now, why do we bother measuring wellbeing? Well, I've tried to articulate this, but the words of Richard Loudd from the London School of Economics is much better than me. How people feel is the deepest reality of their experience of life. It's the way we should think about the quality of a person's life, how they experience it, not as we think it might be. And economists, above all other people, are guilty of assuming that we know how people feel about their lives. Now, it seemed likely that COVID would impact wellbeing, and of course it did. Wellbeing collapsed in the first quarter after COVID hit. But what quickly happened was a V-shaped recovery. We saw a V-shaped economic recovery. We also saw a V-shaped recovery in wellbeing. Some people started to report positive experiences related to COVID: greater work-life balance, more quality time with family. They were living more simply. They felt more empathy. But what we also saw is the gap between people experiencing high levels of wellbeing and low levels of wellbeing started to widen, and that hasn't been narrowed. And more recently, the last wellbeing result we have is for the fourth quarter of 2022, and wellbeing started to fall again, largely on the back of rising anxiety. Now, this is, I think, the scope of the problem in one slide. I think of all the things that I did in the last 18 months, this survey really scared me a little bit. We asked Australians, to what extent do you believe you would need professional help for your emotion, stress, or mental health over the past year? 4 in 10, this is a representative sample of the Australian population, 40% of us said we would have benefited from that help. Now, there was little difference between the responses of men and women, but there was a significant difference by age. Those aged between 18 to 24, 7 in 10 said that they would have needed professional help for their mental health had they got it. What's challenging for a government, and what's really important, is of the people who got it, they said it was of significant help. Only about half the people who said they needed it actually got access to it. Now, the OECD looks at wellbeing, student wellbeing, as psychological, cognitive, social, physical, and the capabilities students need to live a happy and fulfilling life. Within that, they're basically saying it's important that students develop skills to improve their wellbeing, both in the present and in the future. Now, there are various surveys of student wellbeing employed across Australian schools, and they provide really good, significant existing data sets. As discussed for more than a decade, we've got our own. Now, the personal nature of some of the questions in these sort of surveys means that they can be triggering for some children. Moreover, some kids just might not answer them honestly. Now, for this reason, we chose to simply ask about 400 students across the country between years 7 and 12 how they would score themselves on their emotional and mental and physical well-being. But as Biljana mentioned, we also asked about 500 parents how they think their children were feeling. Now, the purpose was not to provide another measure of well-being, but simply to gain a better understanding of how children view their lives. And I would agree with Biljana, because I've sat there with many discussions that we've had about these results and how they might be interpreted, or more importantly, how they might be misinterpreted. So I turn towards someone who knows a lot more about this than me, the renowned child developmental psychiatrist, Dr. Stanley Greenspan, and he provides, I think, some pretty good context and how these findings should be interpreted. And he says, parent blaming isn't only cruel and unfair, it is nonsensical. The quality of caregiving is heavily, even decisively determined by the societal context in which it takes place. But what I do think this research does really well is to shine a light on the complexity of the challenges facing schools when addressing student wellbeing from both a child and a parent's perspective. Now, when children complain that their parents don't understand them, and mine certainly do, often what they're basically saying is, you don't understand how I feel. Now, misperceptions are a pretty natural part of parenting. Often we tend to see our children through our own fears, our own desires, and our own issues. But again, this is not to imply that parents don't care. In fact, quite the opposite. But what the survey does show is a very clear divide in students' perceptions of their wellbeing and how parents think it might be. Okay, thank you. Parents view their children's wellbeing much more positively. They report higher wellbeing for girls then boys are much higher, I should say, than girls. By year level, physical wellbeing is highest in years 7 to 9, lowest in year 11. And then this is through the eyes of the kids themselves. When it came to emotional and mental wellbeing, we also noted a very large gap between boys and girls. Students at private independent schools rate highest. By year level, emotional and mental wellbeing was highest in years 7 to 9 and by far lowest in years 12. We can see in this chart that if the average, so if you ask someone to score an average between 1 and 100, it tends to mask those people who score very low. And this shows you those people who scored under 40, so quite low out of 100. 1 in 5, that was, who had low levels of emotional or mental wellbeing. About 15% identified as having low physical wellbeing. By comparison, 1% of parents thought that their children had low levels of physical wellbeing. 4% of parents thought they had low levels of emotional or mental wellbeing. Low levels of emotional or mental wellbeing were 5 times more prevalent in girls-only schools, again, self-reported by the children and the teens, I should say, than boys-only schools. Nearly twice as many girls overall reported low physical wellbeing than boys. So we move to the next slide, please. We can see, many children have been clearly uniquely impacted by the pandemic, having experienced this crisis during important periods of their physical, social, and emotional development. Now, there are a number of credible research bodies that will report some students are more distracted, more disobedient, more unsettled in their friendships since the pandemic, which raises concerns that the protracted isolation that they have endured has had a lingering effect on children's development and social maturity. Now, a really important question is, are you feeling any better than you felt a year ago? On balance, only 18% of children said, I'm rating my physical wellbeing better, compared to 55% of parents who said it is improved. In terms of emotional wellbeing, only 9% of students said it had improved compared to a net 51% of parents. Now, of course, feeling lonely and senses of loneliness is very normal, and almost everyone, of course, will be affected by loneliness at some point in their lives. Loneliness is an internal feeling, and it's quite possible that a person can feel lonely despite being surrounded by a lot of people. Often when we read about the effects of loneliness, we are talked about in regards to older adults, particularly those very much in the later stages of life. But there is ample evidence that loneliness amongst young people is associated with increased anxiety. COVID containment measures, including social distancing, disrupted many of the normal social interactions for most people. Young people have reported substantial increases in feelings of loneliness during the pandemic. Many adults assumed that, and I think I may have made this assumption, that many young people would find it easy to maintain their relationships virtually because they're so tech savvy, using their phones, using technology, playing video games and so forth. But it's been really challenging for some. We know that touch, we know proximity are really important to feeling socially connected as well. So how prevalent is loneliness amongst students? Quite a bit more than parents might think. When students were asked to rate how lonely they feel, on average, it was 44 out of 100. However, again, using that low range, the bottom cohort of kids, it was pretty high. It's about 1 in 4 amongst boys, or about 25%. What's really interesting when you survey teenagers is the extent to which boys and girls will engage on different questions. Boys are quite happy to answer that question. They're not so happy to answer a question that's coming up. So like loneliness, if we go to the next slide, please, thank you. Anxiety, of course, is also a natural human state, but for some, it can weigh really heavily on their sense of well-being. When school children were asked to rate how well they thought they were coping with their anxieties, on balance, they rated only moderately well, 54 out of a possible 100. Parents, however, scored them about 72. Of concern, a very large number, over 1 in 3, said they were not coping well. Higher numbers, again, of girls than boys. As I say, boys are less prepared to lean into, well, I'm not okay, whereas girls certainly are. Thank you. Now, when we asked these teens what the top 5 causes of their anxieties or worries were, parents were also asked the same question. The biggest driver of anxiety for students was schoolwork, tests, or grades, which impacted 2 in 3 of them as their top response. Over 4 in 10 called out looks, appearance, body image, and rounding out the top 5, as you can see, is mental health, tiredness, lack of sleep, and future job prospects. Parents underestimated how prevalent these stresses were across the board. Instead, parents thought their children's friendships was significantly more important in regards to their anxiety. Interestingly, about 1 in 5 parents said their children did not have any personal concerns or worries, compared to about 4% of students. Now, the common approach, of course, for measuring the effectiveness of an education system or a school is the impact of school interventions on students' academic performance. But increasingly, it's also being argued that non-academic achievement should also be considered. School effectiveness has been examined in hundreds of studies. In many cases, they highlight the low impact of school factors at a student level, while socioeconomic background was a much better predictor of student wellbeing, which makes it much more difficult for schools to combat its substantial influence. In this research, we asked parents how well they thought the school was helping their child with their anxieties or worries. On average, they scored it quite highly at about 68. Overall, about 13% of parents said, were in that very low cohort, they didn't believe the school was helping much. It was particularly high amongst parents of children in years 11. Falls from about 25% of concern in years 11 to 3 in year 12. They perceive a substantial change in the nurturing environment between 11 and 12. So on Monday, we're going to release, as Billiana said, part 1 of this new education series, which will focus on wellbeing. And in a few weeks' time, we'll release part 2, which will focus on the school lives of students, including their enjoyment, when they start and finishing times, their preference, about school curriculum, skills, teachers, general problems and concerns. Now, I don't want to go into detail today about the second report, but I did want to show you a couple of insights that I think are very pertinent and related to wellbeing. Now, feeling positive about school, because we asked a really basic question. We asked kids, do you enjoy school? Because feeling positive about your school environment is associated with higher attendance, better classroom adjustment, more engagement, higher academic achievement. Now, of course, kids don't, as my son will attest, they don't have to love school to experience a lot of the benefits of school, but for some, that dislike of school can become quite pervasive. So overall, the results show that, you know, when you say to a kid between 13 and 18, do you like school? They score at about 59 out of 100. Parents score at about 75. Almost 1 in 4 students, though, scored their enjoyment of school life low, compared to 4% of parents. That said, almost 3 in 10 greatly enjoyed school. They scored at 80 or more. The number who scored it high was noticeably higher amongst boys than girls. What do students like and dislike? Students in the 2 groups of like and dislike like different things, which again compounds the challenges that you've all got, I'm sure. While friends and socialising is the most liked aspect of school for both groups, a much higher proportion of school likers than dislikers choose learning. These findings, of course, are pretty intuitive, but they resonate with previous research which shows students with a history of disruptive behaviour also will nominate schoolwork and teachers as their big concerns. Now, around 3 in 4 students, because kids, you know, while they're complaining in some respects, they really do appreciate the quality of education they're receiving today. 3 in 4, 74% believe they're getting a better education than their parents did. And the number who think they're getting a better education is somewhat higher in public and state schools compared to private, independent and Catholic schools. But this realisation is most appreciated during the final year of school. And you can see in year 12. Year 12 noticeably more, 82% of year 12 students say I'm getting a better education than my parents. Now, education and school communities play a significant role in supporting and developing student wellbeing. Schools, of course, use various different strategies and programs, including school-wide mental health and wellbeing promotion, early targeted support for students with emerging or moderate concerns, and targeted or crisis response for students with complex medical and mental health needs. My brother-in-law is a principal of a pretty big school, so I get to hear a lot about the complexity of that challenge. Parents, however, lack awareness of wellbeing programs offered by schools, and I think that's a bit of a concern here. While 2 in 3 students said their school had a wellbeing program, and I'm sure it's much higher than that, only 4 in 10 parents thought that they did. The lowest number of parents who said their children's school had a wellbeing program were in the public or state school sector. Significantly more students at girls-only schools said that they had a wellbeing program for their children than did students with children at boys-only schools or co-educational schools. Now, in the somewhat biased eyes of students, wellbeing initiatives provided by the schools don't help that much. They scored at about 46 out of 100. Parents score at about 75 out of 100 in terms of how those wellbeing programs are helping their children. By school type, students at private independent schools said they helped most. Overall, 1 in 2 students said they did not help much, whereas just 6% of parents said they offered little help to their children. So what can schools do? What do students believe their school could do most to help with their anxieties or worries? According to students, the top 5 things are putting less emphasis on grades and scores, fewer tests and exams, teachers who are more calm, honest and caring, a less strict policy on uniforms and appearance, and less homework. Now, parents also highlighted some things such as professional counselling and wellbeing services, more safe places, more opportunities for check-ins with students, more feedback on progress and academic performance, and more focus on core subjects. Again, a lot more parents said there was nothing the school could do. Only 2% of kids said there was nothing the school could do. So here's some of the responses that we got from students when we asked them what would help most in a school wellbeing program. And we got lots of responses. You can collectively bucket them, I think, into 3 areas. 1, anonymity, 2, academic support, and 3, professional help. Anonymity was overwhelmingly the big response we got from students. There were lots of comments saying, I feel awkward talking to my teacher. I don't feel comfortable. They will contact my parents. I know that they're required to talk to my parents after I talk to them if I raise any issue, therefore I'm not going to. Academic support. A lot of kids saying, well, my biggest problem with my well-being is the fact that I've got so much schoolwork and I'm feeling under so much pressure. I need more help in that area rather than more meditation programs and so forth. And finally, which is a bit of a free hit from kids, I need more professional help. My problems are real problems. Therefore, I need a psychologist or a professional counsellor. So I think this is a really interesting chart. And this shows the real complexity that I think you all face. So once again, it shows the top 5 things students believe schools could do to improve their wellbeing. But this time, the overall results are in red. But against that is the group of students, the responses from 1 in 4 of those kids who said they really didn't enjoy school, and they're in black. So while students who don't enjoy school want similar things from the kids that do, there are 2 really important differences. One is they want more support for problems at home, and the other one is more remote learning. Now, there's a lot of research in regards to children who live in abusive or toxic home environments and how it places more pressure on teachers to go above and beyond to create that safe space. Control seems to be really important for those kids, where they sit, the projects they work on, how they get help. Maintaining class structure seems to be really important too, to give them some sort of stability. Now, also, while remote learning during the pandemic brought a lot of challenges, some students also reported that they thrived. A handful of them, maybe particularly shy kids, hyperactive kids, highly creative kids, some suddenly started to do better in school. But for some, of course, that unplanned break was pretty severe. Of course, just as demand for new wellbeing initiatives grow, rising expenses, wage costs and cuts to government funding are driving up the cost of many schools. School fee increases, some of which have exceeded inflation, are adding to the cost of living for Australian families. But rising costs are not affecting demand, with the percentage of students attending private schools increasing solidly over the past few years, significantly outpacing the growth in government schools. The concern, of course, is that some cash-strapped parents struggling with rising mortgage costs might turn to unsecured loans. Cost of living pressure, is clearly adding to the collective sense of financial stress. Around 1 in 3 Australians currently believe their finances are a very big cause of stress. We have something called a household financial stress index, which looks at the role our finances have on our wellbeing. It's derived from several key potential household pressures, including meeting the cost of healthcare, mortgage repayments, rent, credit cards, education, food and basic necessities. It's now at a 4-year high. It jumps pretty sharply in Q4. 1 in 4 Australians identify as struggling to make ends meet. Just go back to that one, please. So the top 5 causes of stress. So, when people say, what's the relationship between economics and wellbeing? Well, I think this is clearly it. The top 5 causes of stress, not just financial stress, but all stress in people's lives by Australians. Number 1, identified by over 1 in 2, is the cost of living. That's ahead of things like health issues, personal financial issues, the economy, and mental health. Other common factors include things like stress levels related to family and housing costs. Those living cost stresses are particularly problematic amongst that 30 to 49 age group. Personal financial issues amongst young people is pretty horrendous. Now, these pressures are not only impacting people in terms of how they feel, but their actual behaviours at the same time. So if we go to the next slide, please, we can see that consumers are not only noticing price increases more, but they're changing their spending and their lifestyle patterns to tackle them. Consumers are buying still, but they are much more considered in their spending. They're focusing much more on their outgoings, they're prioritising essentials, and they're cutting back wherever they can. 4 in 10 consumers tell us they've cut back on buying treats such as coffees and lunches, on car journeys to save petrol. They're cancelled or cutting back on entertainment such as going to the cinema. 1 in 3 have cancelled, delayed, or made more modest holiday plans, or cancelled or cut back on food delivery, except for my son, Uber Eats and Menu Log. It's interesting though, where they're not cutting back, and that's the sweet spot that you're in. Much less likely to want to cut back on private school fees, private tutors, and children's activities such as sport. Also, our pet comes pretty close to our kids in terms of where we don't want to cut back on. Now, to some extent, those sort of responses are intentions rather than actions. And we know the lure of our old life is pretty strong. You look at Netflix, for example, they lost 1 million subscribers worldwide during the second quarter of 2022. And then they lost another lot of subscribers. More recently, in the past 2 quarters, they've added more subscribers than they lost in the 3rd and 4th quarters. They've also launched an ad-based service as well. But people think they can give things up, but it's becoming a bit difficult. Now, as interest rates continue to rise, thank you, mortgage stress is also increasing. Mortgage stress dropped to record lows in 2022 as record interest rates and tens of billions of dollars of government stimulus combined to reduce the number of mortgage holders considered at risk. Of course, now we've got a growing number of people who are entering the so-called mortgage cliff, which arises from the rollover of fixed rate mortgages taken out in mid-2020 or to early 2022 at interest rates of about 2.5%, transitioning within 18 months into loans of about 5.5% to 6%. By late 2022, very few borrowers were fixing their loans compared to about 46% in August 2021 at their peak. Now, this is a pretty simple way of measuring stress. How are homeowners feeling about the prospect of rate rises? That level of concern rose really substantially about 6 months ago. It's still rising. About 1 in 2 Australians now think that another rate hike would cause them a lot of stress in regards to their mortgage. Now, financial stress falls across a whole range of spectrum of severity, from general concerns about the availability of money to difficulty in paying for most basic essentials and paying your bills. So we also track sentiment in regards to financial hardship. So people not just feeling financially stressed, but actually identifying that they've fallen into some sort of hardship. In Q4, 4 in 10 Australians identify as experiencing some form of hardship. And that number has risen substantially since the start of 2022. It's now at its highest level in nearly 3 years. Hardship most prevalent amongst those aged 18 to 29, where about 57% of them identify that. Moreover, the biggest form of hardship that people are identifying is not having enough money for an emergency. We're drawing down our savings, and that is making people increasingly concerned about an emergency. Also, number 2, worryingly, is not having enough for food or basic necessities and being unable to pay a bill. So to sum all that up, I think there's really little doubt that the pandemic has disrupted the lives of many young people, and the impacts are continuing to be felt today. I think our research really underpins the complexity of the challenges that you all face when addressing student wellbeing. Parents clearly want the best for their children, but in some cases don't fully understand how they're feeling, and I suspect the pressures that you are under to help kids navigate both their academic performance and their physical and their mental wellbeing. While I don't, as Billiana started off mentioning, I don't expect schools will be surprised by this report, but I do think some parents might be. And of course, as wellbeing becomes a more complex issue, cost pressures on schools are increasing at a time when parents are increasingly sensitive to the cost of living. But I think what is also very clear is how much parents value the education their children are receiving, and particularly how reluctant they are to cut back on education and other activities for their children. Thank you very much.
Dean, thank you. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I hope everyone found it useful. As Dean mentioned earlier, we will be circulating or sharing the report with you next week when we will officially launch with the general public. There will be a question Q&A session after the next presentation. So yeah, would love to hear your views and if any questions from the audience. Now it is my absolute pleasure